It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kathleen Brosnan. She is the Travis Chair of Modern American History at the University of Oklahoma. She is Vice President of the International Consortium of Environmental History Organizations. She is the founder and board member of the Women's Environmental History Network, and she is the past president of the American Society for Environmental History. She received her JD from the University of Illinois and her PhD in history from the University of Chicago. Among other awards, Professor Brosnan has received multiple grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Science Foundation. In addition to numerous articles in book chapters, Brosnan has published 7 books in U.S. or transnational environmental history. Her most recent books were Mapping Nature Across the Americas and the Greater Plains, Rethinking the Region's Environmental Histories. Both came out in 2021, which is quite amazing. She's currently working on 2 books, an environmental history of the Napa Valley wine industry and a transnational study of the transfer of European viticulture around the globe. And on a personal note, I would also add that in addition to Kathy's extremely distinguished, you're looking at me suspiciously, distinguished scholarship, she is also one of the most generous colleagues and mentors that you could imagine. And I'm grateful to her for coming to speak to us today. So.
Thanks. As always, Rona is too kind. As Rona mentioned, I'm an environmental historian. Now, I could be mistaken, but I don't think there's been a lot of environmental historians. A few along the way, maybe, but maybe I'll just tell you what environmental history is. Borrowing from the ASEH website, environmental historians seek to understand the complex entanglements of humans and the rest of nature over time. For environmental historians, nature, a difficult to define term, plays a central role in the stories we tell. Nature, for example, influences history by impinging on scientific studies and political decision-making. Environmental conditions affect personal and public health. Contests over natural resources have contributed to geopolitical conflicts. And in turn, human choices grounded in social, cultural, and religious traditions have influenced the evolution of nature and other species, as well as the construction of built environments. Environmental historians explore serious, often grave issues such as deforestation, acid rain, nuclear waste, environmental racism, among others. Me, I study the environmental history of wine production. But I will try to explain to you today why I think understanding the larger narrative of this non-essential food item is so essential. So as Rona mentioned, I've been working on 2 books, and I might say the way to ensure that the production of any single book is delayed is by trying to work on 2 at once. The first book, as she mentioned, is about Napa Valley, where I'm using the valley as a lens on American consumerism and its implications for human labor as well as the environment. Second book explores the transfer of European viticulture to the New World. Now I'm going to address that complicated notional term, New World, as I go forward. But as I go ahead, I'm going to let you include the air quotes so that I don't have to keep doing that. I had not planned to integrate Israel into the second study on New World wine regions, in part because its wine industry is still has a relatively small export market. But events intervened to change my mind. In May of 2022, I had my first chance to visit the southern Levant region of West Asia. My good friend and colleague, Melissa Stockdale, and I traveled there to give talks at Ben Gurion University of the Negev and to spend time in Beersheba with our good friend and colleague, Rona Seidelman, and her family. On our trip, Melissa and I also traveled to Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, and Masad, and along the way, we enjoyed a fair amount of wine. I get it, Phil? Oh, I have to do it here, sorry. Fair amount of wine, or what I like to call empirical research. But I became quite intrigued with Israeli wines, which were very good, by the way, and wondered what stories this region could add to that larger narrative. So I talked to Alan Levinson, then the director of the Schusterman Center, about returning for a research trip. And so this is a good opportunity for me to express my gratitude to the Schusterman Center for their support, which allowed me to make that research trip in March of 2023. I was able to visit some wineries and vineyards, as well as the archives at Hebrew University. This is a particular specimen from a collection of Aaron Aaronson's. Now, I didn't get back this year as I had hoped I might, but I'm eager to share with you some of my discoveries and initial arguments to date. Please recognize that my greater knowledge is environmental history and the history of wine. I am not and would not pretend to be an expert on Palestine and Israel. And also, please forgive me if I struggle with a few of the Hebrew names. As Rona and I have joked, I'm still working on the whole back of the throat thing. It's coming slowly. Okay. All right. So, onward. Located at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and Europe, Palestine was part of the Fertile Crescent, which many scholars identify as one of the centers for the origin of agriculture in prehistory, or history before written records. Despite its relatively small size, this land enjoys a diversity of microclimates, including those that support viticulture or the cultivation of wine grapes. One such region, the Negev, occupies half of the nation's landmass and is the most arid part. Nonetheless, in the last few decades, a premium wine industry has emerged there. Now, I argue that it has emerged in part by combining ancient foundations and indigenous grapes with modern hydrology and more globally popular Vitis vinifera varieties to stake an economic claim in a global market and to assert dominion over politically and culturally contested lands. Second, I'm going to talk about how in this era of climate change, growers are employing long-term tropes about the civilizing mission of wine culture to justify testing the limits of irrigation and agriculture in the desert. And third, I hope to reveal that Israel, Palestine, and the wine cultures they nurture are now and always have been part of a tradition of globally connected wine networks. Okay, the term New World. In a 2007 study of price-quality relationships for New World wines in the U.S. market, American management professors Ray Reagans and Peter Roberts included Israel in their sample data. They used the phrase New World as a shorthand for a cohort of 7 wine-producing countries that are not among traditional European producers. Now, despite the author's limited use of this notional term for the purposes of their study, it still struck me as discordant. Wine is not new to the Southern Levant. The history of wine in the land of Israel is as old as the history of the people who inhabited that land. The vine has been cultivated in this region since at least 4000 BCE and probably earlier. Tell them I'll come back. Long before it spread across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. Beyond the many references to wine, vines, grapes, and vineyards in the Bible, archaeological evidence of wine production has been found from Galilee to Jerusalem to Negev. Amphoras, or the ancient jars used for storage and transportation, will often list in detail where and by whom wine was made, as well as the years of the vintage, indicating that even in antiquity, the source of the grapes and the quality of the harvest were considered important. During the late Roman and Byzantine periods, the wines produced in what is now called southern Israel were so coveted by Romans that they shipped them to their legions throughout the Mediterranean and North Africa. Christian pilgrims later brought some of the wines back to Europe. The Muslim conquest of these lands in the 17th century put an end to this trade for the most part. The new regimes banned the drinking of alcohol, and as a result, the flourishing wine production declined precipitously. The only wines allowed were the small amounts that Christians and Jews required for religious purposes. Although, as in most human cultures, there were people of all faiths and backgrounds who imbibed in alcohol outside, should we say, the bounds of religious dictates over the centuries. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Crusaders made sporadic attempts to revive the region's industry, but their efforts proved short-lived. Many found it simply easier to ship wines from Europe. So the industry really only began to reestablish itself in the mid-19th century, in part due to the efforts of British and French philanthropists who wanted to expand the region's poor Jewish communities. Some of you probably already know these people. Moses Montefiore was a London-based financier born to an Italian Sephardic Jewish family. His first of 7 visits to the pre-state Israel at the age of 43 profoundly changed his life. He became strictly observant and built his own synagogue on an estate in Ramsgate, England. He is best remembered as a zealous fighter for oppressed Jews across the globe. Knighted by Queen Victoria in 1838, he then received the baroncy in 1846 in recognition of his humanitarian efforts on behalf of the Jews. His early activities included a plan to acquire land to help Jews in Palestine become self-sufficient, as well as attempts to bring industry to the country by introducing a printing press and a textile factory. He inspired the founding of several agricultural settlements as well, including Yemen Moshe outside of Jerusalem's Old City, which was named after him. Montefiore also decided to enable the Jews to grind grain and produce their own flour by building a windmill just outside the Old City walls. It operated for 16 years and after renovations remains in place today. With the encouragement and support of Montefiore, Rabbi Yitzhak Shor founded a new winery in Jerusalem in 1848. This was a great story to uncover. The Shors were previously known by the family name of Galin or Galina. When Yitzhak wanted to open a winery, he needed a license from the Ottoman authorities. He didn't have one. Fortuitously, his brother-in-law had one, and so he took his brother-in-law's name, Shor. He got his license, and he got a new name. The Shor Winery was located in the Muslim quarter of the Old City. 22 years later, Rabbi Abraham Tepperberg followed suit. Originally called Efrat, the winery was founded in 1870 by Tepperberg and his son, Ziv Sayed, in the Old City of Jerusalem. The name was based on the biblical Frata Sheb Bethlehem.
Frata? What was the next word?
I don't know.
Something Bethlehem.
Meaning the road by which the grapes were brought to the winery. I didn't practice that one at home, sorry. Yes, this image suggests the wineries started by Shor and Tepperberg have remained in operation in some form or other through today. And the latter is still owned in part by the Tepperberg family. And there is actually a wine visitor center inside the windmill that Montefiore had built. But really the most important boost in the 19th century came from Baron Edmond de Rothschild, a French member of the Rothschild banking family. His interest in Zionism was first roused by the pogroms in southern Russia in the 1880s, when large numbers of refugees came to Constantinople with a view to organizing groups to purchase land in Palestine and settle there as farmers. Working with this group, Rothschild helped finance Jewish colonies and the first vineyards near Rishon LeZion on the coastal plain. Now, I wanted to talk about some other scholarship that looks at this era of colonization. And in particular, a recent book by a historian named Tamer Novik. It came out last year. Novik describes how biblical dreams of land flowing with milk and honey drew Zionist settlers and Christian missionaries to settle in Ottoman Palestine in the late 19th century. They discovered, however, a desert where they hoped to find a cornucopia. Novik argues that British colonial officials, missionaries, and settlers promoted biblical visions of plenty using various technologies, legal decrees, and environmental policies. More than anything else, they reoriented the production and reproduction cycles of animals such as bees, goats, sheep, and cows, and aspired to monitor and control reproduction among female settlers as well. Thus, Novik argues that plenty was not a description of the local ecologies that settlers found, but a prescription for a technological shakeup that followed the colonial encounter. Colonialism in the Holy Land was thus more than a political project. Instead, it was, quote, a biotic settler colonial project that sought to redeem culture and nature in tandem by creating plenty. Rothschild, whose family became the proprietors of the famed Chateau Latif vineyards and winery in Bordeaux in 1868, had similar visions for viticulture. As noted Israeli wine critic Daniel Rogoff observes, quote, Rothschild hoped that the Holy Land would serve as the source of kosher wines for Jews the world over, and that the wine industry would provide a solid economic basis for the new Jewish communities, end quote. Rothschild imported exports and grapes from southern France and funded the wineries of the new Jewish settlements, primarily Rishon LeZion winery in 1882 and the Zikram Yaakov winery in Mount Carmel in 1890, all with an emphasis on kosher wines. And these wineries also, in some form or another, have remained in operation. Nonetheless, Rothschild's vision for a Palestinian wine industry proved unachievable at that time. And by this, I mean his notion of a worldwide, setting the worldwide market for kosher wines. At that time, the world was in what economic historians call the first era of globalization, which lasted from the mid-19th century until World War I. And many winemakers across the world thought there would be new opportunities for exports. Globalization, as defined by economic historians, involves price convergences for commodities across the world. And for the first time in the late 19th century, large-scale trade in lower value-to-volume bulk products, such as cotton, wheat, and petroleum, and not just luxury items, became profitable for the first time with the widespread application of fossil fuels to transportation. Premium French vintages or Portuguese ports earned consistently high prices across the seas. And many winemakers or sponsors like Rothschild hoped to create export markets for inexpensive wines, but they simply didn't emerge at this time. There was a demand for bulk or jug wines within many industrial nations, particularly with the growth of working classes and urban populations. But for the most part, countries were able to meet that demand through domestic production rather than trade. And so for bulk wines, given the prices they could make across the globe, they were just still too heavy to transport. So they didn't really benefit from this first era of globalization. There was not enough return on investment. Okay, so while there were not price convergences in the bulk wine market, other things did move around the world as part of global commerce. Expertise, technology, living plants, vine cuttings. And when things like that were shipped, particularly in the wine industry, to expand production, to develop new wine regions, or to resolve ecological crises, when those things were shipped, they didn't go alone. Pests and diseases went with them. So this is the phylloxera story. Indigenous to North America, phylloxera is an almost microscopic, pale yellow, sap-sucking aphid that stowed away on vine cuttings to France in the 1860s. The cuttings were most likely brought to France in an effort to resolve another ecological crisis called powdery mildew. The supposed cure proved worse than the illness. Phylloxera feeds on the rootstocks of Vitis vinifera. Vitis vinifera are the vines native to the Mediterranean, which humans have domesticated for millennia and transported around the globe, including Rothschild's imports to Palestine. While it did not directly result in human deaths, phylloxera has been compared to the potato blight in Ireland in terms of its economic impact, although its geographic scope was much more significant. Vitis vinifera lacked natural immunity to the insect. Phylloxera's proboscis has both a canal from which it injects a deadly venom and a feeding tube through which it takes in vine sap and nutrients. In European vines, the saliva causes swellings that inhibit rootlet growth, and they become sites for secondary infections. When the crisis erupted, French botanists embraced an evolutionary explanation and sought a solution that reflected their ideas of natural selection. If phylloxera was a European insect, they reasoned, it would have eradicated European vines long before. So it had to be a new arrival. had to have been imported. They argued that certain American vines were resistant, having evolved symbiotically or parasitically with the pest. Resistant vines rely on a simple evolutionary mechanism. The root forms a kind of pocket sealing off the bite from the rest of the plant, limiting the damage to a local area and preventing other pathological responses. Although resisted for well over a decade, grafting emerged as the only solution. Over the next 70 years, I want you to think of the scope of this, over the next 70 years, every vineyard in Europe had to be dug up and replanted. Every vineyard. They dug up the vineyards, grafted the vinifera cuttings onto American rootstocks, and waited, hoping that they had picked a rootstock that was resistant, that was suitable to the soil, and would produce quality wine, or at least palatable wine. And growers in Palestine also had to replace their rootstocks in the late 19th and early 20th century because phylloxera had traveled there too. So in addition to phylloxera and the limitations of globalization, other events such as World War I, the Russian Revolution, temperance and prohibition in the United States, and Egypt's ban on imported wines further undermine Rothschild's dream of securing a share of the global market by controlling kosher wine production and distribution. Harvest in Palestine and Israel remained modest and focused on what most observers call mediocre kosher wines until the 1970s. I wasn't there to taste them. Until the 1970s, when Israeli vignerons joined a wine revolution. In the post-1960 world, a modernizing wine industry responded to a growing, diversifying consumer base. In the World Atlas of Wine, Hugh Johnson and Janice Robinson point to an industrial revolution, particularly in New World nations, with the use of stainless steel, refrigeration, and the ability to cool the fermenting must. Quote, the modern world of wine started in the 1960s with the almost simultaneous appearance of new wineries with high ambitions in California and Australia, and perhaps most significantly, the launch of E.J. Gallo, a cheap, palatable palatable table wines. I shouldn't have drank those before I came. To cater to a completely new public. But Gallo was not alone in reaching markets around the world. By 1980, the world had entered a second era of globalization. And with improved transportation and shifting trade policies, there were now price convergences in non-premium wine sectors. Before 1980, few nations generated significant wine exports, except for France for the most part. But after 1980, Italy and Spain enjoyed new export growth. A decade later, led by Australia and the United States, New World producers adopted more efficient distribution, marketing, and tourism techniques to claim markets beyond their borders. Their wine sales reflected the acceleration of globalization. And Israeli vintners and growers joined this revolution. Now, revealing the global connections, the University of California would play a significant role in the emergence of a more sophisticated, more scientific wine industry in Palestine and Israel. I'll briefly mention the University of California is a land-grant institution created under the Morrill Act. It was formed in 1868 and is designed to provide classes in agriculture, mechanical arts, and home economics. Over time, University of California shifted its agricultural classes and research to the Davis campus. And in 1935, after the repeal of prohibition, the university opened the Division of Enology and Viticulture in Davis. All of this reflected a larger global trend to institutionalized state-sponsored research, not just in the wine industry, but certainly in the wine industry. As vineyards expanded substantially in the 1960s and 1970s in California, growers turned to university specialists, but their influence didn't end there. The University of California and a few other elite viticultural colleges in France and Australia have provided expertise and research around the world. And this was true in Israel. Cornelius O., a professor of enology from UC Davis and a native of Napa, California, examined Israeli growing conditions and issued a challenge. After spending a sabbatical there, he suggested that the soil and the climate of Golan Heights were ideal for the raising of grapes. That, of course, wasn't the only connection. Davis continued to be involved. It would provide excellent vine stock to help jumpstart that new industry. It sent enologists and viticulturalists to aid the young industry, and in turn, it trained many of Israel's young winemakers until Israel established its own schools of viticulture and enology. More vineyards appeared, gradually spreading across Israel. More importantly, research revealed the best vitis vinifera for specific growing conditions. And when the quality of grapes improved, the quality of wines improved. Vignerons embraced modern science to jumpstart their industry. And then you would see projects like where researchers from Davis and Israel would team up. There was, for example, a 1989 study about the impact of different viticultural practices, environmental factors, and enological treatments on the flavors of wine. Now, following O's advice, the first kibbutz planted grapes in Golan around 1976, and the Golan Heights Winery followed just a few years later. Now, more than 250 wineries operate across Palestine and Israel, many less than 15 years old, and some producing just a few thousand bottles a year. 5 large operations, however, do account for 75% of the production. Wineries have sought to expand their market share by growing the domestic consumer market. They hoped to appeal to an increasingly affluent, urban-based Israeli population and have had pretty significant success. Per capita wine consumption has more than doubled in Israel since the 1990s. Growers and wineries also hoped to establish export networks. And while there is no contradiction between the making of fine wines and the laws of the kashrut, 75% of the new wines were non-kosher, primarily due to marketing issues and labor issues, which I can elaborate on if people would like. So why had people turned to this part of the world to commercially produce wine? Well, it makes some sense geographically. Well, there have always been exceptions, and even more so now with climate change. Traditionally, the ideal areas for the cultivation of wine grapes lie in the 2 strips between 30 and 50 degrees north and south of the equator. Palestine and Israel are located on the southern side of that strip in the northern hemisphere, and thus are well situated for wine production in certain ways. The vine can thrive in many different types of soil, as well as in regions that receive relatively little rain. The land area claimed by Israel is a mere 8,000 square miles or so. To give you a sense of comparison, that's about 5% of the total land area of California. Israel, however, is like many wine-growing regions, such as Italy, Chile, or California, in that it has a long north-south axis. As a result, the range of climatic conditions, or microclimates, is fairly dramatic for such a small country. So I want to now turn our attention to one of the more extreme growing regions. The Negev comprises about half of Israel's land area. It is also, as I said, the most arid region. It consists of clay heights, low sandstone hills, canyons, craters, and wadis, which can experience flash floods when it rains during the winter. Compared to other parts of Israel, it is relatively sparsely inhabited, with a few towns, agricultural and Bedouin communities, and single-family homesteads. For the purposes of viticulture, the region is divided into 2 sub-areas. The Ramat Arad is situated about 600 to 700 meters above sea level and has impressive day-night temperature changes. Okay. This diurnal temperature variation or diurnal shift, or diurnal swing, is the difference between the highest and lowest temperatures in a day. It is an important factor in viticulture because it can affect the quality, structure, and balance of wine. During the growing season, a large diurnal temperature range helps to produce the combination of sugar and acid levels that generate quality wines. DTV, for example, has been an essential factor in the success of vineyards in California's coastal counties, such as Napa and Sonoma. The other sub-area, the Southern Negev, is a lower, more arid area where sandy to loamy soils and very hot and dry summers offer special challenges to grape growers. While some Negev wineries draw on grapes from other regions, others rely entirely, however, on the desert grapes. Now, for both sub-areas, but especially the Southern Negev, the key to their emergence as wine-producing regions has been the employment of sophisticated water engineering projects. The most significant technology is the computerized drip irrigation system that makes it possible to grow high-quality grapes such as Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Chardonnay that are essential to meet contemporary consumer demands within Israel and beyond its border. All of this is made possible through the manipulation of water. In a recent book, Seth Siegel, an attorney and author, writes that despite more than 60% of the nation sitting on land classified as desert and despite limited rainfall, the nation of Israel has avoided excessive drought and even shared its water with neighbors. And that's in part because since 1948, the state has invested in a massive water engineering infrastructure to bring surplus water from the north to central and southern regions. And as I'll discuss, other ecological manipulations have followed. But undoubtedly, one of the most significant actors in all of this is Simcha Blas. He was Israel's leading water engineer. And he developed a technology that reshaped modern agriculture in Israel and agriculture across the globe, as well as viticulture more specifically. First inspired in the 1930s, Blas finally realized his vision for drip irrigation in the late 1950s with the availability of low-cost plastic piping. Rather than flooding the plant's root zone, water and fertilizer are spoon-fed to plants drop by drop through narrow black pipes, whose drippers regulate the amount of water released. In later decades, computer systems eventually optimized the rate and timing of applications. The systems used a fraction of water with much greater efficacy than sprinklers. Partnering with the kibbutz, Blas created a corporation, Netafer, which built Israel's reputation as the, quote, state-of-the-art leader in water engineering, both in Israel and around the globe. Now, drip irrigation solved any number of problems. Evaporation is greatly reduced. Even steep terrain and shallow soils, as well as coarse sands and clays, which always pose problems for traditional irrigation techniques, responded favorably to drip irrigation. Drippers hold an additional environmental advantage because they don't produce aerosols, which can form from conventional sprinklers. Moreover, much of the water delivered to Israeli farms in general and to many of the Negev vineyards is now recycled sewage, helping to ease another environmental hazard. Obviously, it's been treated. Israeli vignerons, as well as other agriculturalists, have reduced water demand per yield to new lows in the new millennium. And wineries and vineyards have often turned to history to justify and celebrate their existence and their progress. So let me turn, for an example, to the Carme Avdat winery in the Negev Highlands, which I visited in 2023 with my trusted research assistant. Okay, this winery represents the mixture of antiquity and modernity that plays a key role in the current wine industry. Hannah and Eyal Israel established their desert estate on the remains of a 1,500-year-old terraced agricultural settlement. An extensive infrastructure for wine production existed in this region between 300 BCE and 700 AD. Wine was then an essential commodity in the settlement and trade in the region. And as I mentioned before, the area's wines were considered superior by people throughout the Roman and Byzantine empires. Hannah and Eyal planted their vineyard with Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Chardonnay grapes, Vitis vinifera varieties that appeal to modern consumers. At the same time, they took care, and I'm sorry my photograph isn't better, at the same time they took care to preserve the ancient terraces and irrigation systems from the earlier farms. When rain first came, they remembered, quote, "We saw the ancient irrigation system come to life, and the vines take advantage of this important source of water. Floodwaters washed the salty desert soil, making it less salty than the usual Negev soil and eliminating the need to wash and desalinate the soil." They also use modern drip irrigation systems that include wastewater. And their system is also connected to the Ashkelon desalination plant, another modern water infrastructure. By the turn of the 21st century, however, questions about the viability of Israeli agriculture and its water usage have emerged, regardless of the efficiencies achieved. Once central to national identity, irrigated agriculture's contribution to Israel's gross national product has dropped from about 30% in the 1950s to 3% today. 92% of Israel's population lives in urban areas, but farms still receive 70% of the water. Critics have questioned the efficacy and equity of those ratios. Oops, if I can read better. In response, agricultural proponents generally embrace tradition to justify possession of the land and the water, speaking to its essential role in creating the Israeli character and to the values that tilling the land supposedly nurtures. They also argue that supporting agriculture prevents greater urbanization and the loss of open space. Viticulturalists, in particular, return to a familiar trope employed in other New World production areas. Settlers often justify dispossession and the imposition of new legal and economic systems as simple economic improvements, while infusing their efforts with rhetoric calling forth larger civilizing purposes. The historian Erika Anikel, who embeds viticulture within horticulture in the United States, argues, quote, "Growing grapes was not just a material practice. It was a powerful ideology, set of aesthetics, and ubiquitous discourse of national power." Viticulture became linked in the American imagination with continental expansion and manifest destiny. Historians Julie McIntyre and John Germoff share a similar narrative in telling the history of viticulture in Australia's Hunter Valley. Quote, "The answer to the question why wine grapes in the Hunter was a combination of imperial ideologies and aspirations, and theories about plant cultivation that were not yet formalized into science. First, there was concentration of early settlers in the Hunter who were influenced by currents of thought about wine growing as a higher form of cultivation than other crops, a symbol of respected, civilized settlement," end quote. So let me touch on another issue as I come to the conclusions here. I'm trying to look at Israel in the context of global wine. And as I suggested, that certainly has not made me any kind of expert on Middle Eastern affairs. But it is important for us to acknowledge that some of these vineyards are cultivated on contested lands in this region. And in recognizing this, I was intrigued by the work of an anthropologist, Daniel Montesquieu, and a political theorist, Ariel Handel. I'm not sure I agree with them, but I thought their work was useful in trying to contextualize the Israeli wine industry. And it fits well with my premise about merging antiquity and modernity for cultural, religious, economic, and political purposes. Montesquieu and Handel suggest that, quote, "Notwithstanding the long delay of 3 millennia of Jewish history, the Israeli wine world displays a deep affinity with other settler colonial spaces and New World wine philosophies, beginning anew, armed with science and technology. The Israeli case, in this sense, represents an old New World hybrid in which ancient histories feed a contemporary exclusionary title to contested territory. Israel sets a claim of primordial autonomy, ancient origins, blank separation, absolute present. Despite the wine industry's full-throated embrace of modern viticultural technologies, I do think this bond with antiquity separates it from other New World entities, particularly when we look at the situations in Australia and New Zealand, for example, which don't even have indigenous vitis species. Given the larger traditions, the question of whether Israel constitutes a settler of society in terms of viticultural production is simply less clear in my opinion at this point. I'm still working on those issues. In closing, let me draw from a noted wine scholar, Steve Charters, who observes that wine has given pleasure to people for over 8,000 years, perhaps even before bread was being made. But he adds, quote, "Wine does not just give pleasure. It is perhaps more than any other drink, with the possible exception of tea, a product which has substantial and far-ranging symbolic significance." So I joked that perhaps wine is a less serious area of study than sewers or deforestation, but it was a joke. Historically, what people ate and drank, and how they ate and drank it, were intrinsically environmental and intrinsically cultural, based initially on available local resources, but also dictated by rituals and traditions, transported around the globe and embodying complex values ranging from religious sanctity to ethnic pride and elitism. Wine was part of a material culture that celebrated certain traditions and reinforced connections to the land through consumption. Consequently, I do believe the study of wine can open a window on a larger culture, as it does here in Israel. The view that is offered from that window is complex and complicated, perhaps as if seen through the prism of a crystal wine glass, dispersing and even modifying the light of the sun. This is very much a work in progress. I don't know all my answers yet. I'm not sure I have all my questions yet, but I certainly welcome your thoughts, and I thank you for your patience.